crossing the Bitterroot Mountain Range in pre-modern times was no easy task. Explorers Meriwether Lewis and William Clark learned that the hard way.
That route was by far the most difficult part of their journey, their route through the Bitterroots. It was the bane of their existence, both going west and east. That was kind of the thought, probably the most disappointing view in American exploration history was when Meriwether Lewis went to Lemhi Pass that day in 1805 and realized that it's a long ways to the Pacific. Every story you read about crossing those Bitterroots, including the people building the Lewis and Clark Highway, it's all a story of difficult go. I mean, that transportation, that Lewis and Clark Highway connecting basically Missoula with Lewiston didn't happen until the 1960s.
One has to wonder, if the Bitterroot landscape is so rugged and unforgiving, why was the Idaho-Montana border drawn in the way that it was? Hundreds of miles of squiggly borderline over peaks, across ridgelines, and into drainages.
But if you look at a map of the West, you look at Wyoming and Colorado and almost, Utah nearly, they're all rectangles and straight lines. And you look at Idaho and something weird happened here. The myth of the Bitterroots and how that border came to be. The most popular is that the surveyors got drunk and lost their way, and hence we have Lost Trail Pass. The problem with that story is that Lost Trail Pass was named long before the survey parties even went out.
The true story is a lot more complicated than that. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the act that created the Idaho Territory, a massive piece of land.
It was all of Idaho, all of Montana, and virtually all of Wyoming. Unmanageable. The very first thing they did, the very first act of that first territorial legislature was to pass a memorial to Congress to shrink the territory. And they had an idea about how it should be shrunk. By this time, people were already calling whatever the new territory is going to be Montana. So the dividing line between Idaho and Montana should be the Continental Divide, the Rocky Mountains. So they sent that into Congress.
But then things get a little messy. Abe Lincoln appoints Sidney Edgerton to be on the Territorial Supreme Court. He makes his way to western Montana and decides the mining boom might hold opportunities for him. Miners give him $2,500 to lobby for a new border along the Bitterroots, not the Divide, which would ensure western Montana mining towns stay in Montana. And by the next year, Montana has withdrawn from the Idaho Territory, establishing the Bitterroot Mountains as the state's boundary, all before Idaho could even object.
And it won the day because the Idaho legislature fell asleep at the switch. It's real important to understand that Congress specifically spelled out, according to what Sidney Edgerton asked them to do, that the border will run along the crest of the Rocky Mountains, northward to its intersection with the Bitterroot Mountains, to the 39th parallel of longitude, and then basically in a straight line to Canada.
And according to Keith Peterson, that decision changed Idaho's trajectory.
What it did was it took what had always been an east-west orientation. It created this isolated panhandle, and you can't understand Idaho history without understanding now 160 years of trying to connect North and South Idaho, culturally, transportationally, whatever. It's all about, so much of Idaho history at least is about trying to connect North and South because trade don't flow north and south in Idaho.